Before colonization, Africa had something Europe feared. That fear wasn't Africa's weakness. It was Africa's order. Long before European flags cut the continent into straight lines, Africa governed itself through kingdoms, councils, guilds, and laws. Empires rose and fell not by accident, but by systems, taxation, diplomacy, trade routes, and justice. From Mali to Congo, Benin to Ethiopia, Africa was not a void waiting to be filled. It was a world already speaking its own languages, answering its own questions. And that was the problem. Europe arrived carrying maps that were empty on purpose. They called Africa the Dark Continent, not because it lacked light, but because its light did not shine from Europe. What they found here unsettled them. Cities older than their capitals, universities without cathedrals, markets regulated without a king's decree, and wealth that did not depend on conquest alone. In West Africa, gold moved through hands that understood its value. In the Sahel, scholars argued law and astronomy. Along the coasts, merchants negotiated prices. In Central and Southern Africa, land was held communally, governed by obligation, not ownership. In the Horn, a Christian kingdom had stood independent for centuries. This is what Europe feared most. Africa did not need saving. Colonization didn't begin with armies. It began with stories. Explorers wrote journals describing Africans as children, pagans, or curiosities. Missionaries followed, declaring local beliefs sinful and knowledge dangerous. Traders arrived with contracts that meant one thing on paper and another in practice. Treaties were signed in languages Africans did not speak, then enforced at gunpoint. When persuasion failed, violence followed. Forts rose along the coast, not as markets, but as chokeholds. Cannons pointed inland. Guns entered trade. Rivalries were encouraged. The more unstable a region became, the easier it was to claim intervention. This chaos would later be described as tribal conflict, carefully erasing who lit the match. Then came the conference rooms. In 1884, European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa among themselves. No African was invited. No African voice was heard. Lines were drawn with rulers, cutting through nations, families, and trade routes. Overnight, communities that had lived together for centuries were declared enemies. Others were forced into unions that had never existed. This too was not an accident. Colonization required disorientation. Break the map, and people lose their footing. Schools were built to teach forgetting. Children learned that history began elsewhere, that their ancestors waited for instruction, that progress arrived on ships. African names were replaced. Languages were discouraged. Archives were seized or burned. Oral history was mocked as myth. And yet, resistance never stopped. From Samori Touré to Yas Santawa, from the Herero to Algerian fighters, Africans fought with strategy, not savagery. They negotiated, adapted, and resisted in ways that terrified colonial administrators. When outright conquest proved costly, indirect rule was invented. Governed through chiefs you control, laws you write, and borders you enforce. Economies were reshaped to extract, not to sustain. Crops were chosen for export, not nutrition. Mines dug for foreign profit. Railways built not to connect Africans to each other, but to ports. And still, Europe insisted it was bringing civilization. But civilization does not require forced labor. Education does not require erasure. Progress does not need chains. What Europe feared and tried to destroy was Africa's self-definition. A continent that could name itself, govern itself, and remember itself posed a challenge to empires built on the claim of superiority. So colonization did what empires always do. It rewrote the story. When Africa resisted, it was called rebellion. When Europe invaded, it was called administration. When Africans remembered, it was called backwardness. The lie held for a time, long enough to be printed in textbooks, long enough to be passed down as fact. But lies age poorly. Today, the archives are reopening. The manuscripts are being read again. Oral histories are being recorded. Borders are being questioned. Young Africans are asking why the story never quite made sense, and finding answers where they were told not to look. Because the truth is this: before colonization, Africa had systems Europe did not control. And that, more than gold, land, or labor, was what Europe feared. Africa was not conquered because it was empty. It was colonized because it was whole. And a whole people, once they remember themselves, are very hard to rule. Thanks for watching. If this story changed how you see history, consider subscribing for more.